Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast and vlog. This is Greg Hotaling from CSS, a Confluence company. And I have with me today a guest who I think will provide some great information, some very useful information about ESG in the EU, specifically with respect to the data challenges. Because as many of you investment firms know who might be watching or listening, data has been very much an issue for at least a year or more now, because the run up to the ESG compliance has we're deep into it now, and we thought it would be a good idea to undertake this podcast and vlog. And I think Shane Flatman here, who is going to introduce himself, will be a great addition and provide some great information regarding that. Shane, did you want to introduce yourself very quickly?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Shane Flatman here, Senior Product Manager at Confluence, with a focus on our Maya platform, which looks after any of our shorter form regulatory outputs, amongst some other things as well. We're mostly around the document production side of our business. Also then with a large focus over the past year on ESG, and not just from the production of SFDR disclosures, but also the European ESG template. And then also seeing how best to bring that all together with our Revolution platform, which is a multi-source ESG data sourcing and analytics platform. So really bringing everything together and putting it into an SFDR and EET solution. Interesting.
Yeah, definitely coming at ESG issues and ESG challenges with from many different angles, it sounds like. Let's we're going to have, I think, a couple of nice takeaways for investment firms and the like from this podcast. But let's first set out the regulatory kind of context for ESG in the EU. So this podcast can hopefully be directed to both people who are intimately involved and have been for a while with ESG issues, but also those who may want to get a little more familiar with the subject more generally. So the regulatory context right now in the EU is that we are approaching probably the most major deadline that we have that we're running, that we can run into. And these next few years will be full of deadlines, but this is probably the biggest one. On the 1st of January 2023, that's when the relevant RTS, the regulatory technical standards for much of ESG regulation in the EU for financial firms will kick in, will take effect. That's the gigantic RTS that it used to be 2 or 3 different RTSs, but it's since been consolidated into one huge RTS, and these are basically technical standards so that financial firms and similar entities can know precisely how to report their ESG related information in the likes of periodic disclosures, i.e. annual reports, or pre-contractual disclosures, in other words, prospectuses, or website disclosures. These can be at the entity level for the entire firm, basically, an aggregate view of the firm's requirements and ESG information, or at the product level, at the fund and product level separately. So it really depends on what part of the regulation you need to comply with for whether you have to make product disclosures or entity level disclosures. But we do know that the 1st of January, for better or worse, will affect all of those things. Now, there are some other deadlines as well. Let me remind you that since we are in, in the fall of 2022 currently, and approaching this January 1st deadline, there are sectoral ESG requirements in the EU that have come into play. So, for example, at the beginning of August, the 1st and 2nd of August, we had, and I'm going to steal a look at my little notes here, but the UCITS, AIFMD, and MiFID all had ESG related requirements regarding sustainability related provisions in their delegated acts, so their delegated regulations. But today we'll mostly be talking about requirements that relate to your obligations as an investment firm, an investment manager, an asset manager, any kind of similar financial entity, a financial market participant, your obligations under SFDR and the related taxonomy regulation. I should note one other thing, by the way. In addition to this January 1st, 2023 deadline, something that's a little bit under the radar for folks, I think, is a deadline coming up on a little bit after that, 6 months after, on June 30th, 2023. Those are your principal adverse impact statements under SFDR. the principal adverse impacts, those need to be disclosed. And, the sort of the main regulation is Article 4 of SFDR, which is sort of entity level website disclosures. But there are, other parts of your disclosures, other parts of SFDR that require you to disclose consider principal adverse impacts as well. So on June 30th is really when you're going to have your first reference period of the calendar year 2022 fully understood. And that's when your principal adverse impacts for that reference period can be fully understood and disclosed starting on June 30th. So before then, you can disclose principal adverse impacts, but you don't need to necessarily refer to a particular reference period. But that's on June 30th. The more urgent deadline is obviously the 1st of January 2023, for the reasons I stated. That deadline affects your periodic disclosures. It affects your pre-contractual disclosures, your principal adverse impact statements on your website. So all of that stuff. And then also I should mention too, that in Article 8 of this gets a little complicated. I'm not going to dive into the weeds too much, but the taxonomy regulation, in addition to complementing SFDR, has kind of a separate provision, Article 8, which is similar to corporate disclosures. It's for financial entities and non-financial entities. And it was kind of a precursor to the corporate sustainability reporting directive in a way. It was meant to look at the non-financial reporting directive, which is in effect now, and sort of improve it. So in a way, it sort of overlaps with that and with the corporate sustainability reporting directive. It confuses people sometimes, but Article 8 of the taxonomy regulation requires non-financial entities to disclose KPIs on the same upcoming date of 1st of January 2023. That's kind of a side note. It's something that a lot of people aren't as concerned about because it may not affect them, but I thought I would mention it. So yeah, EET, Shane, that was a little long-winded, but thank you for putting up with that. But EET, you had mentioned that briefly a few minutes ago. Can you tell us more about it and perhaps why it might be important, or what are the developments recently with EET and where it stands?
Yeah, sure. And what we'll speak about in a few moments is ESG data and the challenges surrounding that, Greg, which I think it has been a constant theme throughout the ESG adventure. But EET was probably the first time that a lot of that data, the data that firms out there are finding challenging to source and challenging to get right, is the first time that data needed to be shared in a CSV format in this instance. So EET, the first deadline put out by Fin.X, the guys, the European working body who have put together the EET, was the 1st of June. I think in reality, it was more late July / start of August when we started seeing EET data circulating amongst the industry. I think, and even at that, I think listening to different market participants and been involved in different webinars, etc. I think it was definitely done on a best efforts basis initially. We're now seeing so that that first delivery of data was done. It was intended to meet all of those MiFID 2, the AFMD, the UCITS, also the IDD requirements that happened on the 1st and 2nd of August, allowing those guys to start considering sustainability as part of their products, whether they're selling products or they're wrapping up products to sell on, etc. So that in theory should be done, out of the way. We're now in a place where there's an additional level of data expected to go into the EET ahead of the 1st of January deadline. So where the recipients of the EET, being the distributors, being the insurance wrappers, those guys have their own SFDR related deadlines coming up on the 1st of January, just like everyone else, but they can't go and fulfill those deadlines without getting this additional EET data into them. So yeah, that's currently where we're at with EET. Again, as both a producer of the EET and an aggregator of the EET here, we're able to keep a close eye on the progress of that data. we're not seeing too much of that additional data come into our platforms just yet. It's very much, just that initial tranche of data there right now. I would say, and again, from listening to the market and listening to our clients and listening to pretty much everyone out there, I would say it's likely going to be early November time before we start seeing large volumes of that data coming into us. But it can't go too far beyond that, because it will leave the likes of those distributors, insurance firms, etc., in a sticky place to meet their own deadlines, so that they will start shouting quite soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. It definitely sounds like, and already when you said November, already to me that sounded like it wasn't maybe quite as soon as they would have liked anyway, right?
For sure. Yeah.
So to meet that 1st of January deadline. Okay, interesting. I've learned something about EET because I didn't know all of that. And I think EET is something that, because it's basically an industry circulated data template and it's not directly submitted to regulators, it's something that folks in us, we in the compliance world don't have our heads around as much. So that was interesting. Let's talk about the challenges with data, with obtaining data, access to data, comparing different data from different sources that are occurring in the EU marketplace right now. And they're well documented, they're well known. I think even regulators have acknowledged them. And so I'll just basically introduce that topic by saying that, yes, regulators, including ESMA, has recently, acknowledged the data issue. I think that, Executive Director Natasha Casanave in a podcast recently said that we understand that there are these data issues and we sympathize basically, but essentially she said, do the best you can. And she was almost, I think, implicitly hinting that there would be some allowance, some perhaps regulatory relief, or maybe relief is too strong a word, but some understanding from regulators that all the data needed may not be there. Now, I wouldn't dive into disclosures and compliance with that approach. I would take the more conservative approach of, getting all the data you can get your hands on and complying 100% with all the regulations. But, if I had to bet, I would say that ESMA would be maybe a little more lenient on the requirements and on the data requirements that you need to disclose, in these early deadlines, such as the 1st of January, 2023. There is a little bit of guidance provided by EU regulation on data gaps, not much. So what we have is, for example, for website disclosure of principal adverse impacts, the data that's, you have trouble getting your hands on, you have trouble finding, needs to be looked for, searched on a best efforts basis. That's the kind of standard. And then another thing that we've been told is that in pre-contractual and periodic disclosures, if you can't find the data you need after a search, what you need to do is not refrain from calling a product sustainable if you don't have access to the data you need showing it's sustainable. So that's really it. Those are two of the instances I have found in the various EU frameworks on ESG that provide, I think, suitable guidance in those narrow areas. But as we know, the data problem is fairly widespread. We have problems with comparing data. We have problems with the vagueness of data. In some cases, even the credibility of the data, whether the data is accurate. So that can be a difficult problem. And those, that kind of regulatory guidance that I mentioned has not really addressed the issue. I guess, Shane, I should probably turn to you now, because I think a lot of people are sort of making the same comments I've been making about the data and how the regulators haven't provided sort of enough guidance on how to handle it. But I'm wondering if you have sort of maybe an understanding or a view on how the industry looks at that. So I guess I would ask, what are the sort of main problems, maybe 2 or 3 main problems that you see that the industry, financial market participants and the like, are running into with regard to ESG compliance and or data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a funny one, Greg, because if you think back to probably 2020, when a lot of these requirements started to become known, data was the first flag I think that everyone was aware of, and people were aware that it was going to be a challenge. Throughout 2021, data continued to be a challenge. Earlier this year, when people really started to look at SFDR and EETs and what's needed, data continued to be a big challenge there. And I was hoping, at the beginning of 2022, I was hoping that by the time we're in October now, that data is no longer going to be a challenge, and it was just going to be something that we've overcome as an industry. It's not the case. So, in my own personal world, well, not my personal world, my working world, we produce the SFDR disclosures, we produce the EETs. Within Confluence as an organization, we do have a multi-source platform that will source data. There's different sides to it. Where I'm the producer of these documents, we've got everything kind of set up, ready and waiting to, run off the PDFs, run off the CSV files. Getting our clients getting the data to us is that challenge, and we hear of a different challenge every kind of week or so, but there's still 2 to 3 main trending challenges that we've seen throughout the whole process. The first one is around finding a market data provider who has the right coverage in all of the areas around PAI and ESG indicators. That's just been a natural challenge. Even when I think clients think that they've found the right provider, doing proof of concepts and things like that, they've found that it's not necessarily the case when they go and open up their full range of holdings to the process. So that's been a challenge, and I think it's still going to remain a challenge until the first batch, or even the second batch of these deadlines are met. There is license challenges naturally occurring. So there's a lot of instances where front office legacy front office processes will have licenses and relationships with the market data providers. What we hear is that those licenses don't necessarily mean, or they're not necessarily equipped or ready to just switch on what's needed for the likes of our back office processes and reporting. And that seems to be holding up in a number of cases, getting ESG data out to us to go and produce these documents. So lastly then, and the big area that we're starting to see now is around, so where our clients, for example, or we hear of firms that would have, their goal was to handle the ESG data gathering plus the calculation process on them. Aim was to handle that process internally themselves. What we're finding now is that while in theory it was something that a lot of systems or processes could handle, we're now getting into the thick of it, and we're putting on pressure to get the data to us. But it looks like some internal processes are simply not going to be ready, or not going to be able to deliver what's needed in time. So a lot of that has brought us back around to say, okay, well, again, where can we help? As I mentioned there, we do have that multi-source platform that we use. So we're trying to see how much we can leverage those guys and provide quick data results over to our client. But no matter kind of what approach anybody takes now, they're still going to be hit with those challenges. And hopefully it just works out over the coming weeks for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And especially, I hadn't really thought of that. The data licensing issue is an interesting one. I think it's probably one that some folks overlook. I wouldn't have thought of it, but, making sure that the data license, if to the extent you can make sure, allows your front office and back office sort of data sourcing to sort of come together. So right now, licensing, it sounds like it's a problem for that. But obviously all the other things you mentioned too.
Greg, that was kind of one of the earlier challenges, which I think most have overcome now. There was, I would say as an industry, I think a lot of firms out there almost forgot or, didn't realize that there was a strong, existing relationship with a particular market provider in place already. And a lot of firms out there would have explored another provider just to see what was out there, or to see or without really kind of realizing too much that those should be kept in sync as much as possible. So that over the past, I would say, over the summer, I think a lot of avenues that were being explored by firms which were different to their front office, that there was a lot of backtracking done then and starting from scratch then again.
Got it. Okay. If you synthesize sort of what you said and you could think of, what would be the couple of things that you would tell a financial market participant, investment manager, about how to approach the data problem to the extent they can, like, what would you tell them the one or two things they should do would be?
Yeah, so I think a big oversight that a lot of firms that we spoke to was that finding the right data provider or data providers was going to be a quick and easy task, and I think a lot have left it quite late or had left it quite late. There's quite a few out there that haven't started the process already by now at this stage. So I think because the single platform route is in my view or in my personal view, there is a risk associated with that. As I said, you can get into a place where you're doing a proof of concept, for example, but then you go and send your full set of holdings and you're finding gaps. A multi-source platform is potentially the route to go there. I suppose it tees you up for a place where you can tap into different providers and fill gaps that way. So yeah, that potentially gets clients out of a tricky position. We're at a point in time now where if clients are having challenges there by going that single platform route, there is still time. If someone acts quite quickly now to get out of that place. Otherwise, it's probably going to be sticking what they've got until the first production run of pre-contractuals and EETs.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, not only is there potentially still time left, we're in the sort of final moments, 11th hour. But I think if you look at this more long term, if you look 5 years from now and you look at all the firms that have invested in their ESG disclosure compliance, invested in their platforms, I think you're going to find that, the firms that have only done it now and maybe even in the next 6 months will still be quite well placed than those firms that decided to put it off for 1, 2, 3 more years. I think even though it seems very late in the game now, I think when you look at the fact that ESG compliance in general is just in its sort of infancy, I think 5 years from now, we'll be looking back and we'll be saying, okay, the firms that started anytime in 2022 or earlier, obviously, but anytime in 2022 or maybe even 2023, are probably doing just fine compared with all the ones that were just kind of left out in the cold and didn't bother to do it at all.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and and the kind of the second part to that, and where I see clients potentially and firms that we're working with, etc., that they could potentially have gone a different path or still can go a different path. So as I said, right now we're in October, November of 2022. A lot of the distributors out there and the insurance firms, etc., are looking for additional data to go into the EETs. There's a bit of a question mark around what fields do these distributors and insurance firms actually need. I think, initially some of our clients were trying to boil the ocean almost and see, okay, well, let's just try give as much as possible. I think that has added complications and as well in that, there's a lot of effort going into try find results that will populate a lot of fields within the EET where it's probably it's far from possible, I would say, to populate every single field right now. So where it's possible and where there's a limited number of distributors that a client is working with, or if they're only sending to a small list of insurance firms or something like that, they can probably speak to those distributors and insurance firms and see exactly what fields they do expect. It's just shortening the list right now and keeping things as simple as it possibly can be in order to meet the 1st of January deadline.
Yeah, makes sense. So that those are interesting observations, especially regarding the sort of, how firms should approach their ESG related obligations at this moment in time, like you said, October, November, with the deadlines all around us. I don't want to make this podcast too long. So because we could, I think, potentially discuss these kind of matters for hours. It's both kind of in our fields. But just let me just round it out by laying out for listeners and viewers attempts to address the data problems from a more general regulatory perspective. So internationally, there have been reporting standards that have been proposed by both the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and also EFRAG, the European organization that they've both recently consulted on reporting standards for ESG information. So, long term, that's good news. Probably won't have any immediate effect because, they're still in early stages. Another sort of development that's occurring from a regulatory perspective is the potential regulation of ESG data providers and ESG ratings providers. So regulating those entities that provide that data and the ratings. ESMA, in its recent call for evidence, noted a lot of problems, some of which we've been mentioned, many of which we've mentioned, Shane, on this podcast, comparing different sources of data, even a misalignment on the definition of ESG, what it means. That's kind of been well known and more recently kind of, I think, acknowledged by a lot of folks in this industry. Delays in updating or correcting ESG data has been a problem. And the ratings methodologies themselves have been a problem. Some people say that they're biased towards, larger firms or even towards, US firms, for example. Many problems acknowledged by ESMA. Separately, kind of in tandem, in a parallel development, the European Commission has put forth its own call for evidence on regulating ESG data providers and ratings providers. And in addition to reaching some of the same conclusions or, seeing some of the same feedback that ESMA has seen, the Commission, when it published its results of its call for evidence, noted that the industry was largely, by large majorities, in favor of regulating ESG ratings providers. And some of these questions that the Commission put forth to the industry were responded to in majorities of like 90%, 95% for issues of whether they thought that there were problems in ESG rating providers and problems in the ESG ratings, some of which we've mentioned. And perhaps most crucially, whether the industry wants to regulate ESG data providers and ESG ratings providers, which is, the industry responded with a firm yes in quite large majorities there. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that along with the reporting standards that I mentioned earlier, that bodes well for ESG data. It bodes well for the idea that we're going to be able to compare ESG data, solve the problems of sourcing, hopefully some of them, accessibility, comparability, credibility. But those are long-term developments. These are regulatory actions that really won't take effect and won't bear fruit until maybe a few years from now. So in the meantime, for at least the next couple of years, I think the industry, financial market participants and the like, I think, Shane, are going to be basically facing the problems that you laid out and having to address those problems in the way that you laid out as well. So unfortunately, I think these regulatory initiatives, while well-intentioned and probably will be effective, aren't likely to bear any fruit until at least another couple of years. So really, that's about it. And Shane, unless you wanted to add anything else, I think we'll probably wrap it up.
No, that was all from my side, Greg. Appreciate you having me on.
All right. Thanks a lot. Shane Flatman again. This is Greg Hotaling, and thanks everyone for listening and viewing this podcast on ESG data in the EU. Okay, take care.